As we present the gospel with someone, and we're walking through the truths of who God is, His ways, and our inability to keep these ways, our sinfulness, I think at this point, it's a good time to pause for reflection. And Will Metzger provides a few questions after going through everything that we've done so far in an evangelistic gospel presentation to pause and to ask questions of those that we're sharing the gospel with. And one thing first that I want to point out that Will Metzger doesn't include in the Come Home presentation is his question on the summary, the Come Home overview. His question is, do you admit you are a sinner? And if you've seen American Gospel, you've heard Paul Washer talk about this. If you watched the sermon from Paul Washer a few weeks ago, I want to quote from that. The question is not, do you know you are a sinner? The question is this: as you have heard me preach the gospel, has God so worked in your life that the sin you once loved, you now hate? And the reason this is important, why make this distinction? Well, because an acknowledgement of sin in and of itself is not enough. I mean, think of experience in your own life, recognizing something wrong you have done. That is not enough to make ourselves right and to do the right thing. We can become guilty of the wrong thing that we have done, but inevitably it may happen that we do that same thing again. Even demons believe and know of their opposition to God. They are proud in their opposition of God. What people need is not to be asked, do you admit you're a sinner? I mean, that would be a helpful starting point maybe, but we have to go beyond that to a conviction of sinfulness. Has God so worked in your life that your heart has been made new? As David said, create in me a new heart and give me a right spirit within me. And so we ask, has God worked in your heart that the sin you once loved, you now hate? Now, this is not going to be perfect. We're not going to evidence this immediately, and nobody will evidence this immediately, that we perfectly love God when we are converted and we perfectly hate our sin. But there is some evidence. There is an ounce of that is going on. And so a few more questions that Will Metzger poses are this. And you can find these in the book, Will Metzger's book, Tell the Truth, on page 279. This is the Come Home presentation laid out. And these questions are at the bottom here. And I think it's important, helpful to think through these things. And here are some examples of the questions he asks. Are you willing to admit that you are accountable for your sin and totally unable to keep God's rules, that you cannot save yourself by any attempt such as good deeds, church membership, helping others, fighting injustice, etc.? Do you agree that the Bible teaches that you are spiritually helpless? For sin is like a deadly cancer in your life. And do you realize that the road you are on leads to self-centered living now and eternity separated from God and others in hell? These are the harsh realities and the difficult questions that it might be for us to not only swallow, but to say to someone, but oh, how much they need to hear these questions and to hear the gospel and to recognize their sinfulness. And so the big dilemma, if someone has gotten to this point, you've shared the gospel with them, and you get to this point and you realize that they recognize their sinful nature, they recognize their need, that they cannot do anything in their own power, the dilemma is then, as Will Metzger puts it, quote, therefore you and all of humanity are in the dilemma of disobeying your Maker. The concern that should be yours is, how can I, a guilty sinner, become acceptable, meaning forgiven and righteous before God, my Maker? Do you have this concern? And admittedly, this is bad news. But unless you are convinced of the dilemma, the good news of a loving Savior and Father calling you to come home will seem completely irrelevant. People need to know what they're being saved from. Just saying, "Are you saved?" or something like that has no value. What are they saved from? Unless we recognize our need to be made right with God and our sinful nature. And so at that time is a time for pause and serious reflection. And then at that point, depending on their answers and where they're at, you can ask them if they would like to continue to hear of the good news that is available in this dilemma. And that good news is that Jesus is the way back to life. We are not left without hope. God has provided a solution to our dilemma. And that's what we'll talk about in our next lesson.